Welcome back to The Rational Nationalist. I'm your host, Lee Ellis, and last week we talked about how individuals, organizations, and society at large create metaphoric windmills out of minor problems because they are incentivized to exaggerate their problems. Today, we'll move on to a related phenomenon in which people don't necessarily overstate the problem. They just ignore information that suggests that the problem isn't as big as it used to be, or how people interpret information in a way that fits their pre-existing worldviews, often forcing square pegs through round holes, so to speak. First, this isn't something that should surprise anyone. Everybody who has a grandmother or any other older relative knows firsthand that people aren't great about updating their prior assumptions. After all, your grandmother greets you with cookies and kisses even though you're now 25 with tattoos, a child, and a criminal record of your own. This isn't a unique occurrence. It's human instinct to develop theories about how the world works, and once formed, to try to preserve those theories against external threats. In this episode, we'll focus on contradictory evidence as a threat, but similar defense mechanisms occur with counter-arguments as well, though, again, this is too extensive to get into here. First, a word of warning. Throughout this show, I'll talk about a smart way of doing things and a stupid way, kind of like a Goofus and Gallant comparison. To be clear, this is not to say that smart people do things one way and stupid people do them another. Rather, we all do things smartly and stupidly some of the time. That's important to remember in general. Just because one person is smarter than the other doesn't mean the smarter person is always right. Rather, they'll simply be correct with a greater percentage of the time. Blind reference to intelligence causes problems in many organizations and settings. That little side diatribe against intellect aside, let's dive right into the meat and potato of today's episode. Why are we all so stupid? Or at least, why do some of us do stupid things some of the time, or all of us do stupid things some of the time, and some of us do stupid things all of the time? In this case, we're asking why people cling to their beliefs even when the contradictory evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. It's not just flat earthers and conspiracy theorists that do this. In fact, almost all of us do it at one point or another, though many will deny that. I don't care how many leads I watch them blow. I firmly believe the Pittsburgh Pirates are going to win the World Series this year, and no one can tell me otherwise. Now, not all beliefs are this absurd, and even if we're blind to it in ourselves, we all know people like this. Try convincing any parent that their kid is actually a shitheel, and you'll quickly find out what I mean. No matter how crappy the kid actually is, the parents usually just aren't seeing it. This is the most obvious blinder that we wear, and why even someone like Tywin Lannister can see everything but the incestuous affair in front of him. People have a blind spot where loved ones are involved. I think that most people have at least some first-hand experience with this, so I don't want to waste too much time here other than to point out that it doesn't have to be anywhere near the level of a parent-child bond before people start twisting the evidence in their favor. You see this with a lot of celebrities, friends, and church leaders, and is probably most clearly seen in political candidates as every election cycle you can see the mental gymnastics being done by partisans to justify their support for their candidate. You notice you never simply hear a surrogate acknowledge the flaws in their candidate, and face it, all candidates have flaws. Instead, they'll twist the evidence well past the point of absurdity in a way that favors their campaign. The fact is that we instinctively interpret evidence like lawyers rather than scientists, trying to defend theories we like and reject the theories we don't. How strong this effect is depends on how much we care. We'll bend over backwards to interpret facts in a way that suggests our child doesn't suck at everything because we really care, but when it comes to other children, we readily see their complete and utter lack of talent. Basically, any theory we like for any reason undergoes this same theory defense mechanism. In other words, we put our thumbs on the scale to either reject contradictory evidence outright or to explain it in a way that doesn't threaten the underlying theory, narrative, worldview, or any other opinion that we're trying to defend. The extent to which we put our finger on the scale depends on how attached we are. The more invested we are, the more mental gymnastics we'll engage in before giving up and either modifying or abandoning our prior assumptions. There are any number of reasons we might favor or be biased towards a particular theory, but we've talked about many of them at length on previous podcasts and we'll touch on them on future ones. Things like social pressure, career or professional incentives, affinity as touched on above, or social and ego needs, that is, the need to either present a certain image to others or preserve a self-image, all play into it as they played into the decision-making process of the individual decision-makers within the organization a few weeks ago. Theoretically, we ought to evaluate the new contradictory evidence as objectively as possible and decide how much, if at all, to revise and update our theories or assumptions. The things we just mentioned and have discussed at length often influence our evidentiary assessment subconsciously or subtly. We still evaluate the evidence, we think we're being objective, but now we're viewing it through lenses painted in accordance with our incentives. This often occurs when the theory is tangentially related to the new evidence rather than directly impacting it. For example, we might be more likely to believe a negative story about an actor we dislike than one of our favorites. And depending on our proximity and the circumstances, we may even be aware of it and let it happen. Not too many people are going to really take the time to be objective about a meaningless news story, for example, one about a celebrity. This is clearly a case for our System 1 or intuitive/heuristic, lazier, more efficient cognitive processing system. What I'd really like to talk about is the reasons why people might be inclined to intentionally distort or attack evidence. In other words, why people would knowingly twist evidence to protect a theory or narrative they know to be wrong, or at least should know is wrong based on the evidence. Denial is a bitch, and we should never underestimate the human ability to avoid facing unpleasant truths. Why do people continue to believe in and advocate for narratives they know to be lies or theories they know to be false? Actually, that's still a little too obvious, so let's refine this further. Why do people continue to believe in theories and stories even when they've been proven wrong and the evidence against them is staring them right in the face? Probably the most obvious would be a public statement of the theory or belief, especially when you've advocated for this particular point of view in the past. As you can probably imagine, this is a huge problem in academics and journalism, where people often have major professional interests in a particular theory or story being true. This is where journalists bury stories, fabricate sources, and academics attack studies that undermine the theories that made them famous. A note, this can also work in reverse, as in extreme cases people can also fabricate the evidence to support a theory, the inverse, kind of attacking evidence that contradicts a theory, but that's another podcast. For now, you can see how certain people might have reasons to dismiss, ignore, or downplay certain evidence. This is where the ad hominem arguments often enter the conversation. Rather than attack the evidence directly, they'll attack the source of the evidence. For example, rather than deny the factual truth of his allegations, the intelligence community attacked Edward Snowden as a traitor, distracting from the main event, so to speak. Another tactic is often dismissiveness. Instead of addressing the evidence, just ridicule people for caring about it, acting as if they're beneath you in as condescending a tone as possible. For example, anyone who questions the veracity of your story is painted as a wingnut, and the evidence they offer to contradict it constitutes nothing more than conspiracy theories. I've even seen the media go so far as to characterize a literal stack of evidence, and I do mean literal in the correct way this time, a stack of evidence as supporting baseless, quote, allegations. Clearly, the evidence the media included in their own photograph of the story constitutes at least some basis for the allegations. Both of these tactics serve to preserve the narrative, theory, or whatever in two ways. They embarrass the presenter of the evidence into going away and taking their inconvenient evidence with them, and they intimidate others from asking too many questions. These thought-terminating exercises ensure that nobody looks too closely at the house of cards on which one's professional reputation is built. Another reason to manipulate people is for personal gain. Certain narratives trigger people. In other words, some topics and words immediately, involuntarily put people into an emotional state and prime them to see evidence in a certain way. For example, as soon as something takes on religious, racial, political, or some other undertones, a lot of people have immediately made up their minds and formed an opinion before they even know what the specific facts of the case are. Again, this is absolutely not an allegation. Everybody does this, and it's involuntary. I suspect it's because these issues speak to a theory that has been confirmed by personal experience. In other words, people know the overarching narrative to be true. Therefore, they apply the general to the specific, assuming that because the theory is true, it must apply to the facts of this case. Additionally, as I've mentioned, there's an instinctive emotional component to this. That's because most of these issues hit close to home. Therefore, we don't see the case at hand as happening to someone else. It's a direct threat to our own well-being because what's happening to them could very well happen to us. This is why it's so important to take a step back in cases that hit close to home. We want to make sure we're judging the facts in front of us, not reading our own experiences into it, as in 12 Angry Men or The Judge with Robert Downey Jr. and Robert Duvall. Furthermore, people know this about other people and will exploit it for a variety of reasons. The first and most dangerous is for political gain. And as with many of the most dangerous human impulses, this one can be motivated by the best of intentions. Pretend you have a pet issue. You know it's an issue and it's valid. You've been combating it firsthand and have seen how urgent the issue is. Say it's child abuse again. We've gone to that well before, and it's a pretty good well since that's a pretty non-controversial topic, with most people agreeing that child abuse is bad, and it lacks the more tribalistic connotations that are immediately attached to more hot-button issues, as I just finished discussing. So, here, you're Kathy the child abuse crusader, and you hear about a case. Now, having fought child abuse your whole life, you know how hard it is to get people to give a damn. Like, no matter how much you've been screaming, how many campaigns you do, how many telethons you do, if that's still a thing, still barely a trickle of public support. This case, however, has caught people's attention for whatever reason, and now the floodgates have opened. public support, donations. You've even scheduled an interview with a senator sponsoring the legislation you've been working for years. It's been stalled all this time, but it's now expected to pass pretty easily. Everything's just rosy, right? Except there's a bit of a catch here. As more evidence comes to light, you begin to question the story. Well, that's actually generous. The whole thing is clearly bullcrap. Now, there's shades of gray generally in the real world that we can talk about with ambiguity and mental gymnastics and so forth, but we're not going to do that here. We're going to keep our model or our hypothetical very simple. You know it's wrong. What do you do? I guess you could do the honorable thing and come clean, or at least not contribute to the ensuing storm of lies and disinformation, since a lot of other people with their own agendas will be acting simultaneously. Bully for you, but that's boring and a lot of people aren't so pure. No, let's play this hypothetical a little more sociopathically. You want to be senator, or a congressperson, or whatever. You can ride this mob of outrage to office now that you're the leader of the social cause du jour. Or those donations? Maybe your office needs a retooling or you need a new company car. Either way, why look a gift horse in the mouth by wondering if your star case, the one that's bringing in all the money, is actually true or not? Either of these goals only work if the facts of the case end up fitting the narrative you've been trying to sell for years on child abuse. Worse, depending on how different and how far things have gone, you'd risk blowback if it turned out to be a falsehood. Still, you can see in this case why even honest people might be tempted to bite their tongues and ride the wave of public outrage all the way. After all, it's for a good cause. Speaking of sociopaths, you may or may not be aware that some people are extremely good at manipulating others for their own ends. They know what these societal narratives are and what buttons to push, and have no qualms about exploiting social narratives and well-intentioned individuals to either get themselves out of trouble or create trouble for those who've wronged them, or extortion targets, adversaries, anybody they want to make trouble for whatever reason. Even after people realize they've been used, many will continue to go along with the narrative for their own ends. Either they'll deny they've been used, or just continue to play along for their own benefit. After all, they had the best of intentions when they started, and they need to protect the narrative so that people don't get the wrong idea about their entire cause. Thank you for joining us on The Rational Nationalist. I've been your host, Lee Ellis, signing off.